Hello, hello, hello. Today we're going to discuss a famous person named Richard Simmons. And we're going to talk about Richard Simmons, the exercise guru who is now crossed over, and the person who probably knew him the best, other than maybe his mother. It's none other than Winfred Morice. Winfred Morice was his assistant. She wrote his cookbooks. She wrote the Deal a Meal program. She traveled the world with him on the Cruise to Lose cruises. And we're going to interview Winfred Morice and see what she has to say about him. And she has a good viewpoint because she's a nutritionist, she's a hypnotherapist, and she is an expert on, I don't know, wellness. Let's just say a wellness expert, probably the number one in the world, Winfred Morice. Okay, Winfred, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Shelley. What an introduction.
Well, it's all true. Listen, I know you've written 4 books for Richard. You wrote books for, gosh, I have a list here. You wrote books for, um, gosh, all kinds of people like Weight Watchers. You wrote books for Lowry's. You wrote books for Vandekamp. You were the spokesperson on the Dinah Shore show. You were the nutritionist on the Dinah Shore show in the day. You're just the expert on good well-being. And I'd like to hear about you and your relationship with that wild and crazy guy, Richard Simmons.
Oh, well, it's my joy to talk about Richard because we had 16 wonderful years where I was his nutritionist, and it was it was a game. It was fun. It was a game because it wasn't like a real job. How can you have a real job with someone like Richard? He was exactly as ever, if you ever saw him on TV, and who didn't, he was just like that. Shelley, one day I remember going for a serious meeting. I really needed to get his input on certain things for a book that we were writing. And he just got up on the desk in the office. There were just the two of us in the office. And he started singing songs from Gypsy, I think it was. He went through this whole musical, putting in all the actions and just craziness. And I kept looking at my watch, and he kept singing, and you couldn't, once he was on a roll, you just had to let him roll. So that was the fun of it. And in our whole relationship, he liked to say that we only had 2 fights and that he was right both times. Well, I didn't quibble about that one, but we had a fantastically fun relationship, and it was unexpected. Um, I don't know how to describe it, except it was joyful and funny. You know, Richard, as you know, was just a ball of energy, and he didn't get that energy from any outside substances. He didn't drink tea or coffee. He didn't drink alcohol. He just had it in him already. And thank goodness he didn't add anything to the pot because he was incorrigible. I used to tell him he was like a 5-year-old with power because he was rather irrepressible. He didn't obey the rules of life. And Shelley, you know me, you know I'm a rule follower.
Yes,
He
you
was
are.
the opposite. So, oh God, one time we were in Canada going from grocery store to grocery store, playing some kind of game that I had to devise that everybody, I devised, I can't even remember what the game was, but it was about, it was sort of like ingredients for a recipe that people had to, well, we had the method, I think, of the recipe written up on this board, and then people had to guess ingredients. And when somebody came up with what the recipe was, they won some kind of appliance. Well, it was fun. We were going from place to place in some part of Canada. But every time we ended one of these episodes, we went back to the limo, and it was very hot weather, I remember. And there was, yeah, no, pink bubble gum pasted on the outside of the passenger door, sort of melting down the side of the car. And Richard said, who would do such a thing? Ugh, that's horrible. And the driver had to clean it all off, and we'd get in the car and go to the next place. And at the next place, when we came out, there was bubble gum on the door of the car. And this happened about 3 times till I realized it was Richard putting the bubble gum on the car. And he thought it was hilarious. He thought it was so funny. But he wasn't very pleased with me because we had such a tight schedule that I was sort of making sandwiches and things in the car as we drove along. And he didn't get a chance to go to a restaurant or anything. And I was sort of monopolizing what he was eating. So we stopped in one of the hotels we were at. He ordered room service. He told me he was doing this. He said, I'm ordering room service for 4 people. But it was just him in the room because he didn't want me telling him what he could eat anymore. And of course, because it was Richard Simmons, they brought all this beautiful table and everything was set up beautifully, and the waiter was standing there waiting for all the other people to arrive. And then Richard said, oh, it's all right, I can manage from here. And of course, there was nobody else arriving. Richard was dining without anybody telling him what he could or couldn't eat. But he was pretty good about what he could and couldn't eat, obviously, because he kept all that weight off for so many, many years.
How did
And
you meet him, Winifred? How did you even encounter this man?
well, it's almost, I can hardly really put it together. I was living at the time in Tustin, California, and a New Zealand friend of mine who was sort of an acquaintance got in touch with me and said this guy, Richard Simmons, was looking for somebody to teach at his exercise classes. And he had them all over Southern California in the Los Angeles area. And he called them anatomy asylums. And he wanted somebody to teach nutrition in these different places. And I had to apply for the job. And so well, as an aside, the best part of working with Richard all these years has been all the wonderful people who've become lifelong friends. And it was my dear friend, Jeannie Peters, who was his main nutritionist at the time. She interviewed me for this job and I got the job. So I hadn't met Richard for a while I was working for him. But I knew he was doing all these other things, and I thought, gosh, there's so much I could do for him because I was so used to writing cookbooks and things. And I thought I could be doing more than just what I'm doing. So I went to one of his exercise classes in Beverly Hills, where he had Slimmins, his exercise place. And he took us through a guided visualization at the end of the class, lying down on the floor. And we had to visualize where we would be in 6 months. So I visualized myself working side by side with Richard. And when I got home, I thought, well, I better tell him so that he'll know what to do in the next 6 months because I'll be working with him. So I wrote him this long letter, and I wish I had kept a copy of that, but I didn't. And he wrote me a lovely letter back saying he would keep me in mind. And he promptly forgot about me. I never crossed his mind at all. But this is the funny part, weird part. I got a phone call from this company in Pennsylvania asking me if I would write a cookbook for Richard Simmons out of the blue, out of the absolute blue, because I guess people had heard about different things I had done. And I had actually had a cooking show called The Dieting Gourmet in the 70s. And that's a whole other story. It was the diet, it was the, what was his name? Graham Kerr, the Galloping
Galloping
Gourmet,
Gourmet, yes.
and Julia Child. And then I was on Channel 5 on Saturday mornings in LA and Channel 13 in Philadelphia. And so I think because that was in that area that somebody knew about me. And so I got the job in that circuitous kind of way. And they told me I had to come to Richard's house on a particular day with all these foods, like a breakfast, a lunch, and a dinner based on his idea. Now, the dealer meal cards, the initial cards were created with when Jeannie was still working for him. And I updated them a couple of times and redid them. Richard was the one who had the idea of doing the cards in the first place, having cards in a wallet. And one thing about Richard, he was brilliantly creative, very artistic. In fact, I have a little card here with his handwriting, handwriting on it. You can just see he had that flowery handwriting, and he he was just he was so creative. He had a clear there. His
Hold that
writing
there for a
was
minute.
just,
Let's see it.
just
Talk. Let's see. Can
oh, can you see it, or is it back to front?
Yes. Yes, read it to us.
Oh, he wrote me a poem because he gave me a beautiful South Sea pearl for a Christmas present. And this is the poem he wrote to me because one thing Richard loved about me more than almost anything was the fact that I could write a poem at the drop of a hat. And he let me write poems in his cookbooks, which I loved. And he was always calling me and asking me to write a poem for, well, somebody's birthday or General Hospital's birthday, 30th birthday. He put a poem that I wrote for General Hospital on a whole page of Variety magazine to celebrate General Hospital from Richard. And one day I know I'm digressing. One day we were in a limo going to QVC. He was on with Sally Jesse Raphael. And just as we were pulling up, he said, "Oh, it's Sally's birthday. Oh, I need a poem. Can you write a poem?" I said, "Oh, okay." And I got out, and within like maybe 15 seconds, he said, "Is it done yet?" And I said, "Richard, if you could keep quiet for 2 minutes, maybe I could come up with a poem for you." And that was hard for him. And he was struggling. "Is it done yet? Is it done?" And finally I said, "Here, take it." And so off he went into QVC and enthralled Sally Jesse Raphael with this poem that he had just written for her.
What right
So
to you?
lots of fun. Oh, you really want me to read this? He put W. My father always called me W, so that was rather special. "I tried to match your beautiful hair color and match your fine level of taste. I went to great measure to tickle your feather. It belonged to a mermaid who lived thousands of years ago. It is frozen snow for you from God. I'm just delivering the gift to you. Love, Richard, 1994.
Oh,
So it was so
that's
sweet,
great.
so sweet. Here's another um, little photo of us on, it might be hard to see on one of the
Just
cruises.
hold it and talk while you hold it.
Okay. So we were always doing these food classes together on the cruises, having so much fun. One day, the captain of the ship said, "How come, all you people, supposedly you're losing all this weight on this cruise? Why isn't the ship sitting a little higher in the water?" And I said, "Aha, because all the other people on the cruise are eating twice as much and keeping it all level." But we used to lose collectively over 1,500 pounds on a cruise.
How many
I
people on these cruises?
about 400 and something. But they were such wonderful, wonderful cruises because Richard endeared himself to every single person. And the people who came, some of them had never left their hometown, never been on a plane, never been anywhere, but they felt so connected with Richard from his shows on television that they were able to bring themselves onto a ship where they may not have even known other people. And they felt this incredible sense of belonging, sometimes for the first time in their lives. He was so caring and loving and supportive. And well, let me just say with a slight caveat there, until about Wednesday. And then it was very hard for him to still be on his good behavior. And because he was such a kid at heart. He would start, the little half and half packets that they would put for people to have. He would start throwing those at people in the dining room and and I would have to be like his mother and say, "Richard, you can't do that. If one of those should break and somebody slipped on the half and half and broke a limb, you would be liable." Oh, well, he hadn't thought of that. And it wasn't hard to be Richard's mother because my birthday was the same day as his mother's. So we had that in common. Wasn't that amazing?
amazing.
It
Amazing.
was.
Now, I
Yeah.
remember you told me about he really liked visually how food was going to look that you prepared. And I remember you told me a story when you were preparing. For everyone who's watching this, Winifred wrote the cookbook that won the cookbook of the year in America for Richard. She was the author, but she did it with under his name, but she got credit, but she wrote the cookbook and they won a big award. But
Mhm. That was for this book, Farewell to Fat. And I said, Richard, this is the third book I've written for you. I think at this point, I should have my photo in the book with your photo. I said Rosie and Oprah had their photos together on the book that Rosie wrote for Oprah. And I actually I gave a copy of the book, Rosie's book for Oprah. I gave a copy to Richard and I put my face over Rosie's face on the cover. And he wasn't amused at all. However, he must have thought about it because in that book, here we are together in the back flyleaf of that book. And the only reason that he put me in front of him was because he didn't have any real pants on. He was between changes for something and he had underpants on and an apron or something, but he hadn't got around to putting his pants on when the photographer was ready to take the photo. So he stuck me in front of him so he wouldn't look so pantless. So that's why I'm not really that famous. I was just stuck in front for a reason. Um, where were we?
Now,
Oh, yes.
I know where we were. He
Yeah.
liked the way food looked. And you told me a story once about preparing some food for the cookbook. And you brought it to him, and he didn't like the way it looked.
Yes. I would try to prepare about 12 things a day. And not only, I had a wonderful assistant helping me with all this. It wasn't that I was doing it all by my own self, but I would drive up to his house with all the food in the trunk of my car laid out. It had to be on beautiful plates. I had to have everything just as if I was going to put each dish on the cover of Bon Appetit magazine. Seriously, it was absolutely incredible how visual he was. So I've always said I could write a cookbook of recipes rejected by Richard Simmons because he would reject anything that didn't look right. One time I took a perfectly delicious meatloaf and he would have none of it. Didn't like it at all, didn't like anything about it. So I just took that recipe back and revamped it. And I brought it back the next week as a rolled meatloaf with spinach in the middle or something. It was colorful so that when you sliced it, it was like a roll. Wow, he just loved it. I think he called it Rolls Royce meatloaf or some weird thing, but it was just the way it looked. It was the same meatloaf. So,
You just made it look fancy.
yes,
That's
yes.
so funny, so funny. So I know that, well, he was a very eccentric. Do you have any eccentric stories about Richard that you want to share? Some of them you can't, I think.
Oh, one that is really typical Richard. He he had some guy coming from CBS News to interview him in his kitchen, and he needed me there at about 8 or 9 o'clock one morning. And when I arrived, the first thing he said was, "Did you bring your accordion?" And I said, "My accordion? No." He said, "Oh, we're doing spaghetti, and I wanted you to walk through the kitchen during the interview playing a solo mio." And I said, "And what would that contribute to anything?" He said, "Well, then I could say, well, doesn't everyone have an accordionist in their kitchen?" Or something like that. And so I called my husband, who had his own company, running his own company down in Torrance, and I said, "Oh, I need my accordion. Can you bring it up?" Which he did. Anyway, in the meantime, before the guy arrived from CBS, Richard gave me a handful of M&Ms and he said, "Could you just run out and plant these in the garden for me?" And I said, "What? Where?" He said, "Well, just plant them in a row." Because he said, "I want to be able to take the guy outside and show him what I'm growing in my garden." I thought, oh, well, I never questioned Richard because that's what life was like. It was just one surprise after another. And why would I complain when I'm having such a fun time? So I went out and I planted all the M&Ms, about 6 inches apart in one long row. And then when I went back, Richard said, "Oh," he said, "you better take me out and show me where you planted those because I want to be able to show the guy. I want to dig up a few and show him what I'm growing." So we went out and I dug up where I planted them, and all the colors had gone. They were all just little white things because the ants in his garden had never had such a feast. They, the word got around instantly, and that whole row of M&Ms was just a row of little white beans. So he said, "Oh, well, I guess that didn't work." But he was so happy when the accordion arrived. And of course, when I went behind the guy during the interview playing O Solo Mio, the guy during the interview said, "What the heck was that?" And Richard said, "Well, doesn't everyone have an accordionist in their kitchen?" Exactly as he said he was going to do it. So there was never a dull moment. And I think because I'm somewhat playful, I think I enjoyed it so much because he utilized any minor talents that I might have. like like being able,
You're a great accordionist and a
well,
great pianist. I mean, come on. And for those of you who don't know, Winifred's a star in her own right. She writes poetry, she writes songs, she writes music, she plays, she entertains, she puts on one-woman shows. But right now we're focusing on Richard
Richard.
Simmons. But I
Yeah.
want to focus on you in another interview because you are so multi-talented. So tell us some more Richard Simmons quips here and stories because they're all so fascinating.
They really are. He was he was just a law unto himself. Well, when I married Don, who's I can say he's my third husband because I'm also his third wife, so we're even. But I was dating various people, and I would say, "Oh, I'm definitely marrying this particular person," and Richard would say, "No, you're not. No, you're not." So Richard saved me from marrying several of the wrong guys, waiting for the right one to come along. But once I married Don, he said, "Oh, let's go and buy you a wedding present." And he wanted a ride in my Miata car. It was when little Miatas first came out. And he said, "Let's go to the Beverly Hills shopping center and we'll get you a wedding present." Well, I was a bit unnerved by this because first of all, I didn't know really what he had in mind or what anything. So everywhere we went, he would say, "Oh, this is my favorite perfume. Oh, I'll have some of this." And he bought this and he bought that. And then he said, "Oh, look, 3 to me and none to you." Like he was doing all the shopping, but I was too slow. He said, "Hey, if you don't buy something at the next shop, you'll be out of luck." It was just a crazy shopping expedition, and he bought all these things. And then I bought this crazy sweater that I actually donated it somewhere a few years ago. It was really extraordinary and beautiful. He said, "Oh, thank goodness you made a decision, and okay, we can go now." But everything was just such a whirlwind. It's it's hard to describe exactly what those years were like. And I wasn't just the only person working with Richard here. There were a team of us. I would have gone out of my mind if it had just been me. He had a wonderful manager and other people who were equally, if not more important than I was. One of the people was a wonderful woman who organized all the cruises, the travel agent. And when he brought her on board for this job, he said to me, "Oh, you're just going to love her. You and she are going to get along so well." And we are still friends to this day. In fact, she lives in Wichita, Kansas, I think, somewhere. No, wait a minute. She lives in Arizona now, but I saw her recently in Mexico because we keep in touch. And I'm still in touch with so many precious, precious people who came on Richard's cruises. And
How many cruises were you on with Richard?
I think about 18 to 20.
Wow. Over what span of time?
Well, I worked with him, I think it was about really working with him about 16 years, and wonderful, precious years that really gave me such a sense of freedom. And one of the fun things was there was no budget ever allotted to any of these projects. Like the cookbooks, he wanted a photo to go with every recipe. And it makes such a difference when there's a photo with a recipe. It's just, I mean, it makes you think, oh, well, is that what it's supposed to look like? So the first cookbook, I don't even know where they got the photographer, but at the end of the day, I looked at the photographs and I said, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to redo all these. And they were very annoyed with me and said, what on earth are you talking about? These are perfectly good photographs. And I said, but they are not food photographs. We need a food photographer and we need a food stylist, because you can't just take these photos and have them look wonderful in a book. And so Richard listened to me, and it cost money to do that. But also revamping all the dealer meal cards to make things match with the recipes, it was a lot of money. And I said, well, I can't do it until everything adds up. And we got it all together. And Richard fell in love with the food photographer to such a degree that he became Richard's only photographer for all of his photos, food or otherwise. And his name is Ed Wallette. And he was just absolutely superb at taking the most amazing photographs for the cookbooks. So everything with Richard was a huge team effort, and I was just part of the team, quite honestly. But we worked well together. We taught classes together, food classes, and Shelley, I can't imagine. The world is such a different place without Richard in it. And I know he became very reclusive in the last few years of his life. And in fact, I was part of that podcast about missing Richard Simmons. And it went viral all over the world, and it was almost a point where Richard almost came back again, but he didn't. And it was only in the last little few months of his life that he started reaching out to people again. And, I do think that we have a certain knowing of when our time of departure might be near, because Richard started talking about dying and about, but in a very kind of okay way. Very interesting.
Did you meet his family or any of his relatives?
Yes. Years ago, he had a birthday party for his mother and for me at the same time at somewhere in Beverly Hills. That was fun. But his childhood was difficult, and he was very close to his mother, who worked, and his father stayed at home and kind of looked after Richard and his brother Lenny. And if Richard had done something just reprehensible, which was probably every other day when he was a kid, his father would not set a place for him at the table, as if he didn't exist. And it was those sort of things had a psychological impact on Richard, where he felt he had a lot of things to overcome, from being overweight as a child, and he pushed through all of those things. He was irrepressible. He was a special soul on this planet, for sure. And he saved a lot of lives. He brought a lot of people back to life who didn't know that there was a place in the world for them. And it's interesting, Shelley, because we live in a different age today where having extra weight doesn't carry the stigma that it did in the time when I started working with Richard. And for women to buy real clothes, you could really just go to Lane Bryant. And I don't know if that store's, I'm sure I haven't heard the name in years, but now you can buy things in all shapes and sizes. Models come in all shapes and sizes. There isn't that emphasis on one size fits all, because how silly is that when we really stop to think about it?
Yeah. Now, I
So,
remember seeing him cry a lot.
yes,
Was that true? Would he cry a lot for his people?
he would be so moved by people's stories. Or actually, on the cruises, we cried more and laughed more than at any other time. He could cry and laugh almost simultaneously. He was his mood could be changed quickly. But yes, he was very empathetic with people, and he did care for them incredibly. He did.
Did he ever eat any junk food?
Yes, he did. And he made it look as if I was the one eating it, because we would go out to a restaurant and he would, I would order something because I was with Richard and I wanted to set a good example. And then he would say, why aren't you getting the pancakes? I said, pancakes? Why would I order pancakes? Because I want some. And he couldn't order them because the waitress would look at him and say, Richard Simmons is ordering pancakes. And I was thinking, well, a waitress would think just as that I was an idiot for ordering pancakes in front of Richard Simmons. He could never see that. So he oh, and then I took my friend Judy on a cruise with me, and she's little, she's very small, you know Judy,
I know,
but
Judy.
she's a voracious eater. She was sitting at the head table with Richard and with me, and she would order, on a cruise you can order several main courses and whatever, it doesn't matter, you can order whatever you like, which she did. And Richard would watch her eating, and he just gave her a title, One Cruise Judy. You are never coming back, he said. And he couldn't bear to see her eating so much and being so small. It just wasn't fair.
Did he ever flirt with you?
Oh, he did. He flirted with me a few times, but just not, certainly not anything meaning anything. We had a few funny things that I really can't talk about that were really hilarious. But no, he never flirted with any of us on purpose.
No, I saw him once on Whose Line Is It Anyway?
Oh
He
gosh,
was
was that funny?
outrageous. He was just outrageous. They didn't even know what to do with him.
That's for sure. That's for sure.
Yeah.
I know.
So if you could encapsulate him in, a word or phrase, or how would you describe this man that you worked with for so many years, who's legendary really in the culture?
Yes, he is.
Maybe in a paragraph, how would you describe this guy?
He was absolutely on from the second he woke up in the morning, and he would make a bazillion phone calls when he first got up. Have you been on the scale today? What did you have for breakfast? He'd call people all over the place, and he had energy all day long. If one time I was in Raleigh, North Carolina, I guess it is, with Don, my husband, and I got this a feeling. I said, I feel as if Richard is in the airport. And I hadn't made any plans. I wasn't with him at that time, but then I could feel a kind of buzz, and it grew. And all of a sudden I heard the voice, and it was Richard, and he was saying hello to everyone. He was skipping through the airport and doing a few high jumps and things. And it was, and I thought, typical Richard. He never took a moment off, except when he got on a plane to go to the next place, he would just zonk out. He would go completely asleep, like a baby, like when you put a baby to sleep and you hope it goes to sleep, just out. And then he'd wake up and he'd be on again. So he was literally just a firecracker. So if I were to encapsulate him, I would say that he had a lot of pain inside him that he never really dealt with, or he dealt with it in his own way. But by having having experienced so much pain, he was able to really feel other people's pain and to guide them to a better place at the expense of his own health sometimes. You know, he would be exhausted. Well, we all were exhausted by the end of every cruise. It took me, several days to recover, really, because the energy was so high all the time. But he was a kind, generous, brilliant, brilliant person. Brilliant. And just, I think he could have done so many things because of his talent. He was definitely a true artist in so many ways. His home was exquisite. And one thing, I'll tell you one little story. When I first started to do this cookbook for him, he had 6 Dalmatians, most of them which were in the kitchen all the time, and they weren't all house trained. So it was rather difficult, to put it mildly. But I was doing sort of a breakfast thing that I had to do for him to taste, and I needed a piece of toast, and he didn't have a toaster anywhere at all. So I had to turn on the oven because that was all I could find and I thought, gosh, I need to equip this place. Anyway, I turned on the oven, and then I was busy doing some other things, and I burned the toast. I thought, oh my gosh, this is my first and my last day. I was sure I'd be fired. So I threw the piece of toast out on the front lawn because I didn't know what to do with it, because already the smoke alarms were going off. And within a few minutes, literally, the Beverly Hills Fire Brigade, or whatever they call them, had arrived. And all these gorgeous firemen got out of it and came into the house. And Richard flung open the front door and his arms out like this. And he said, oh, he said, you're just too late for breakfast, and pointed to the burned toast on the lawn. Anyway, he said, now you're here, would you like to see my house? And he took them all around his house to the top floor where he had a gym and everything. And after they left, I had made his day. He said, oh, weren't they cute? Weren't they adorable? And wasn't that fun? And so I lived to see another day.
Did you buy him a toaster?
Oh, you better believe it. I bought him a sharp knife. I bought him a toaster. I bought him a kettle. I bought him a black and white kettle, like a Dalmatian kettle. And he kept that. Oh, that's another story. See, there were a few little quirks about Richard. He told me I was the worst person at giving presents of anyone he knew. I was just a really bad present giver. And he said mainly it's that I just don't know how to wrap up a present. I'm a terrible present wrapper. So he said, well, he wasn't a very good present receiver because, and again, it's this petulant little child that would come out of him. Somebody would give him a lovely gift and he'd open it, look at it and say, isn't that lovely? And then he'd say, would you like it? And give it to the next person next to him. He would just give it away. So I said to Richard, I've come up with the solution to this terrible situation where I can't give you the right presents, because I would agonize over what to buy for a present for him. I mean, it wasn't easy. So I said, I've decided now, when I see something that I think you would really, really love, I said, what I do is I buy it and I give it directly to somebody else and avoid the middleman. He thought that was brilliant. He loved that. He said, that's perfect. So that's what I did. Oh, goodness.
Fred, you two were quite a team. For those who haven't figured it out by now, Winifred's definitely her own person as well. What a twosome they must have made together. I only had the privilege of talking to him once on the phone. I said, I'm Winifred's friend. And he went, Winifred's friend? I love Winifred.
Yes,
So you were loved.
we were a really good team because I didn't take too much nonsense from him. I didn't get upset when he was having a bad day. I would just wait till it was over. Because, that didn't happen very often. And as he said, we only had two fights, and he was right. But
He was
uh,
right both times. Do you
yes, both
remember the
times.
fight? Do you remember the fights?
I do. I do. I made the mistake of bringing a whole bunch of food up one day for him to taste. And he was having a meeting with actually a lot of the cookbook people from the East Coast. So I went in and I said, "This is perfect. Could I get some of you to help me bring in the food?" And that's where I made the mistake. Richard said I was too cheap to bring my own assistant or something like that. I don't know. But anyway, I I I got into a terrible fight with him. I mean, he was very upset with me for interrupting his meeting, and he was right. He was right about that. But I'm trying to think.
Gosh, I don't, gee, that seems like such a minor offense, but
I know, but it wasn't, I should have laid everything out perfectly instead of having somebody carting in the stuff. And then his assistant, this was the same day, and I'm trying to think what happened. It was sort of escalating until this is how he was. His assistant, who was adorable, and we are still close, he said, "Richard," oh, because I think he told us we could all, more or less get out of his life. And so he said, "Richard, when you die, will I get your things? Will I get some of your things?" And Richard said, "Yes, when I die, you will get everything you ever gave to me. And believe me, they will all fit in a very small box." And we all just fell about laughing. It was so funny. It was just so funny because that's how he was. He would just turn things.
and that was the end of the fight.
Oh, yes, there was no more fight. It was just so funny. We were all, oh gosh.
Winifred, Winifred, Winifred. So you yourself are writing books. Are you ever going to write a book about him, do you think?
Well, it's funny because when I stopped working with Richard, two publishing companies approached me from New York to write a tell-all book about Richard Simmons. I think they were looking for sort of the spicy stuff, the nitty-gritty. Whereas if I ever were to write a book about Richard, it would be full of all the tender, fun, extraordinary times that we had together. And I mean, there are a few other funny things, like the few I've just shared with you now, which you pulled out of me. But um, I hold him in the highest, highest esteem. So nobody would be getting a tell-all kind of book from me because I would tell all the good stuff. And
All the good. Well,
most of it is.
that's Winifred Morice, ladies and gentlemen. Winifred, thank you so much for taking time out of your wonderful busy
Oh,
schedule to talk about Richard Simmons. And I look forward to another interview where you tell us all about Winifred Morice. That's going to be our next interview. But thank you so much for being with us. And I am Shelley Stockwell Nicholas, and it's been a pleasure to
my
present to
pleasure.
you reflections of Winifred Morice and her dear friend, Richard Simmons.
Yes.
Bye for